Welcome everyone to Hatfield House, and thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm Venice Jones-Rahi, I'm Head of Archives and Collections here at Hatfield. So I'm delighted to be sharing this moment with you as we celebrate the return of the Rainbow Portrait to Hatfield House. The portrait spent nearly 2 years away, firstly on loan at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and at the Cleveland Museum of Art, and latterly in the studio of oil painting conservator Nicole Ryder, who's going to speak to us today, as well as in the labs at the Courtauld, where new light was shed on the circumstances of the painting's creation. Now, the Rainbow Portrait is such an enigmatic piece because there's a huge amount that's not firmly known about the painting's commissioning, creation, and symbolism, sparking centuries-long debate in the art historical community. So this recent opportunity to take a much closer look at the painting out of its frame and in Nicole's studio has allowed for substantial further study and technical analysis of the painting, as well as a chance for a number of experts across disciplines to view the painting in a new light, literally. So with our 4 experts this evening, we're going to delve into the recent conservation work and investigations, as well as the historical context that framed the painting's commissioning, composition, and execution. So our first speaker this evening is easel paintings conservator Nicole Ryder. So Nicole has 30 years of experience working in paintings conservation for museums and historic collections internationally. She's going to speak to us about the conservation work and technical analysis carried out on the Rainbow Portrait and what that work has revealed about the painting and its creation. So over to you, Nicole.
Thank you, Venice, and thank you all very much for coming this evening. Can you all hear me okay? Great. It was a great privilege to share my conservation studio with the Rainbow Portrait for most of the last year. We had many visitors, and I collaborated with various experts in the field, 3 of whom are here this evening to explore the complexities of this extraordinary portrait and the time in which it was made. As part of the conservation process, the painting underwent technical analysis for the very first time, the results of which were rather unexpected. Some mysteries were solved, some assumptions challenged, but new questions have arisen. In the limited time available, I hope to show how this painting did not have a straightforward genesis. Originally, it looked quite different. It went through a transformation that spanned the country's great shift from the Tudor to the Stuart era. The biggest single change was the gilding of the mantle with 24-carat gold leaf. As well as illustrating this and other changes, both intentional and through the passage of time, I will explain the conservation treatment and briefly discuss questions of authorship and dating. The painting was last treated 65 years ago when the well-known firm of London restorers William Holders and Sons carried out a partial clean, mostly to the face and the lighter passages. The incentive for the recent treatment was both aesthetic and structural. The 18th century lining was embrittled and failing to support the painting adequately. It needed to be replaced, and this was successfully carried out. The painting was also dirty and diminished by discoloured varnish and retouchings, which altered the colours and distorted the tonal relationships, particularly in the face and in the mantle. In the conservator studio, a thorough examination is the first part of any treatment. Out of the frame, original tacking edges were revealed on all 4 sides. On such an old painting, this is rather rare, as these precious and informative strips of canvas are often missing due to previous structural treatments. On the screen is a section of the bottom tacking edge, showing the end of the painting with the continuation of the unpainted, original canvas beyond, proving for the first time that the painting is not a cut-down, full-length portrait as previously proposed by some art historians. The Rainbow Portrait is named after its rainbow. However, the rainbow now appears pale and colourless, and this has provoked some eccentric Freudian theories, proposing that it was always meant to look like this. We now know that originally the rainbow was brightly coloured, but like other areas in the painting, it has faded. On the left is the tacking edge, with a section of the rainbow which has been protected from light by the frame rebate, and consequently it has not faded so significantly. Pigment analysis was an important component of the technical research, and through this we discovered that the faded pink is a carmine lake. This fugitive pigment is extracted from dried and crushed cochineal insects, and it is originally a rich transparent red. The green in the rainbow is a mixture of azurite and lead tin yellow, and this area has suffered less change due to these traditional pigments being much more stable. It wasn't until later in the 17th century that Isaac Newton established the visible spectrum of 7 colours as seen in a rainbow. Before this time, depictions of the rainbow sequence were generally simplified, as can be seen in this painting. Other parts of the painting have also faded. Pigment analysis confirmed that the outer grey side of the mantle originally looked quite different. The pigments here are a mixture of carmine lake again and the blue glass pigment smalt. Fading of both these pigments has resulted in a dulling of what must originally have been purple, and the manipulated image on the left gives an approximation of this original colour. Analysis also revealed the presence of tarnished silver leaf, which once decorated many parts of the costume. The image on the left, in red, highlights in red remnants of a scrolling pattern that was delineated in real silver on the large collars to the billowing outer cloak. And we know from original sources that the Queen owned such light transparent garments interwoven with strips or thread made of real silver. Also shown are the now hidden hanging jewels that were covered up when the collars were altered and made larger. The covered up jewels are very similar to those seen in this detail from the National Portrait Gallery's Ditchley portrait by Marcus Gerhardt the Younger. And as in the Ditchley, the Queen was originally wearing an armillary sphere earring, but this was changed to the present large chandelier drop earring. You can just about see that in that image in the bottom right corner. You can just see the band of the armillary sphere. The repainting of the collars could have been carried out to conceal the silver pattern once it had tarnished, or it could have been done to simplify the design and increase the focus on the beautiful face. X-radiography and infrared imaging are extremely valuable in the study of paintings. They can show changes, indicate condition, and illuminate aspects of style and technique. Our technical images were unexpectedly complex, revealing major changes to the bodice, the mantle, wide collars, neck, pendant, and earring. Although the costume and some jewels have been altered, the face and headdress have not been modified in any significant way. In this X-ray image, on the left, we can see that there is an earlier painted mantle underneath the gold, which was more substantial, extending out to the left of the body with diagonal folds in the opposite direction. And the Queen's left hand initially held a slimmer section of the mantle, and there is an extra finger in the X-ray from the earlier hand arrangement. Pigment analysis told us that this first version mantle was painted a rich red colour, which was modulated to a high degree of finish with highlights and glazed shadows, and crucially, the bizarre eyes and ears. However, even with all these changes, there is nothing to suggest that the costume was ever anything other than the mask style presently depicted. It is possible that originally the mantle continued diagonally across the torso, as seen in many Jacobean mask costume portraits, and illustrated in this example of a lady of the Hampden family dated circa 1610. As well as alterations to the lower part of the costume, the flowery bodice was significantly changed. On this X-ray image, the red outlines indicate this area of modification. What's really unusual about the bodice change is that the paint was carefully scraped off when it was dry enough to create sharp and fractured edges, as can be seen, I hope, in these detail images, top right and left, where you can see the sort of jagged edge in the middle of the photos. The pale white ground was left on the canvas and a new white bodice was painted into the scraped back area. Sprigs of flowers based on illustrations from books such as Gerard's Herbal were then drawn in freehand before being painted back along with the middle section of the pearl necklace. It's difficult to speculate how long after initial painting the changes to the bodice were carried out. However, one might expect an artist to use solvent and a rag to wipe off paint if they wanted to make such a large change during the initial stages when paint is softer and more soluble. So perhaps it suggests the passing of some months or maybe years. We can't be sure, but it seems likely that all the costume modifications were done at the same time. The artist who carried out these alterations painstakingly gilded around the mantle's pearl edging, as well as the eyes and the ears. And in some places, the gilding overshot, covering up outlines. So the artist went back to repaint the edges of the eyes and the ears. And you can particularly see that in the ear on the left, where you can see that the gold has gone over the ear, so the artist has gone back over it. The reason for the covering up of the mantle with gold leaf could have been due to a deterioration in the red paint of the first version mantle. Analysis of the paint composition showed evidence of a disordered mixture with formation of lead soaps. This type of paint deterioration is well known to conservators, and it can cause unattractive pockmarking at the surface. And remnants of this red paint were also discovered further up in the bodice under the pearl knot of the necklace, which might explain the major alteration to this area as well. The obscuring of the red mantle with thick 24-carat gold leaf must have been visually transformative. While it could have been carried out to disguise condition issues, it could equally have been prompted by a change in the artist or patron's original intention, perhaps to update the costume and emphasize the Queen's sun-like brightness. This infrared image shows one of the eyes on the earlier red mantle, which has been cleverly repurposed as a leaf as part of the flowery pattern on the sleeve during the alterations. Although most eyes and ears pre-existed on the original red garment, a few on the right side of the painting look slightly different because they were painted back on top of the gold leaf when the mantle was altered. The eyes and ears on top of the gold or underneath it look consistent in style. Creating a credible illusion of drapery folds in the mantle would have been tricky on the reflective gold surface, but the artist skillfully achieved this using thick red glazes and the occasional scumble of opaque paint. The truncated and simplified appearance of these folds has led many to believe they are mouths. It seems more likely that this impression is created by the limitations imposed by painting on a reflective gold base layer. The artist wanted to create folds and three-dimensionality, but didn't want to apply too much paint over the gold, as this kills its warmth and its luminosity. The source for the surreal combination of disembodied eyes and ears are personifications in Cesare Ripa's emblem book, Iconologia. Although everyone acknowledges this highly influential source, nobody really addresses the fact that the real success of this book started with the second edition, published in Rome in 1603, with, for the first time, large woodcut illustrations. While an artist and patron could have been inspired by the first text-only edition published in 1593, the distribution and scale of both eyes and ears in the rainbow portrait seems too close to the woodcuts of the 1603 edition not to have been the version that inspired the painting. And if this was the case, the rainbow portrait, or at the very least the mantle decoration, would have to have been composed after the Queen's death in 1603. This sequence of images gives an insight into the process of retouching the large losses at the bottom of the painting. Combinations of yellow ochre and raw umber pigments usually work well when retouching small losses to gold leaf. However, real gold leaf was needed here to conceal these losses convincingly. Conservators nowadays use stable and reversible materials. Therefore, a synthetic varnish was used as the mordant to attach the gold leaf, and the glazing was carried out with mixtures based on modern versions of the original pigments bound in a stable retouching media. These images show the painting during cleaning and the difference made by removing discoloured varnish and dirt. Cleaning uncovered the luminosity of the gold leaf and the very well-preserved face of the Queen. And during cleaning, different eye colours appeared on the mantle: blue, grey and brown, as well as eyelashes on 4 of the eyes, suggesting these eyes represent different individuals. The infrared images of the rainbow portrait revealed clear underdrawing in the face and in the bodice. This type of underdrawing suggests that the face was created using a pre-existing face pattern. During this period, the use of face patterns was a practical way to satisfy consumer demand for portraits of the monarch or other eminent person. The rainbow face pattern shows similarities with both the Ditchley portrait by Marcus Gerhardt the Younger, as well as Nicholas Hilliard's Mask of Youth miniatures. Mask of Youth is a term coined by 20th century art historians to describe portraits of the Queen developed in her 60s that adopted a standardized image of vitality and beauty to assert her undiminished political relevance. The style and medium and handling of the underdrawing are reminiscent of underdrawings found on works by Gerhardt thought to be based on face patterns. However, the actual painting of the face in the rainbow portrait differs from the gaunter Ditchley face prototype. The eyes are painted dark grey rather than brown, and the cheeks and mouth have been made plumper, resembling Hilliard's more youthful and flattering miniatures of the Queen. Traditionally, the rainbow portrait has been attributed to either Marcus Gerhardt the Younger, John de Critz, or Isaac Oliver. These artists were all related by marriage, and it seems likely they were professionally collaborative. Isaac Oliver is not known to have painted in oils, and so, for the moment, unless new evidence surfaces linking him to painting in oil, he can be discounted. However, the traditional attributions to de Critz and Gerhardt are both credible, and different aspects of the style and technique in the rainbow portrait are consistent with the work of both these Anglo-Netherlandish artists, perhaps even suggesting some sort of collaboration on the painting. The face has more similarities with Gerhardt's, while the costume and hands are not unlike the work carried out by de Critz for the new Queen Anne. But unfortunately, no documented payments have been found to link the commissioning of this painting to any one artist or patron, and its location in the first few decades of the 17th century is unclear. Most believe Sir Robert Cecil, Queen Elizabeth's chief minister, commissioned the portrait as part of his housewarming celebrations at his new house on the Strand in December 1602, in much the same way as Sir Henry Lee commissioned the Ditchley portrait in 1592 for his royal entertainments. But it's equally possible that the portrait was acquired by Robert Cecil from someone else, or that he commissioned it after the Queen's death as a memorial to her. In the Hatfield House archives, there is a bill that could strengthen the Rainbow Portraits link with the artist John de Critz and prove it was already in Robert Cecil's collection in 1607. This bill has been mentioned by other authors, but not really in connection with the Rainbow Portrait, because the alterations have not previously been known. The other obvious candidate that this document could be referring to is the famous Ermine portrait commissioned by Robert Cecil's father, but this painting does not have alterations. The bill seen on the screen is to Robert Cecil from the artist John de Critz, and it's dated 1607. Amongst other payments on this bill is a charge of £1 for altering of a picture of Queen Elizabeth. £1 is a quarter of what de Critz is charging for a new painting on the same bill, so this payment is substantial. We know that around this time, John de Critz, who was sergeant painter to King James, was also busy working for Robert Cecil. De Critz and his workshop were painting portraits, gilding, and carrying out domestic decorative painting for Cecil's grand new house on the Strand. The decision to gild the mantle is a bold and brilliant intervention, not simply a restoration, and one which, along with the other costume alterations, would have dramatically altered the appearance and even the meaning of the painting. One could perhaps argue that if a patron needed to make alterations to a relatively new painting, he is likely to ask an artist connected to the original work. Before I hand over to the next speaker, I'd like to finish with some comments on the sumptuous and richly symbolic jewellery. Published records of Queen Elizabeth's New Year's gift exchanges and wardrobe convey a wealth of information about her clothes and jewellery. And because of this, we know that the serpent, the crescent moon, and the gauntlet all share similarities with real jewels owned by her. The exotic headdress, however, is based on an illustration from one of the great French or Italian 16th century costume books. The body of this headdress is decorated with a scrolling design created with a sgraffito technique, whereby the artist scratched through the top layer of paint with a hard instrument to reveal a contrasting colour below. The artist embellished the headdress with golden feathers and a jewel-encrusted crown, topped with a large ruby or spinel, diamond, and pearl-encrusted crescent moon. The moon is the well-known attribute of the virgin goddess Diana, sometimes referred to as Cynthia, and it is associated with many of the later portraits of the Queen. The obvious difference here, however, is that the moon is turned to the right, rather than as a downward or upward-facing arc, which is the usual way to see it depicted. And this seems quite deliberate, suggesting further layers of meaning, possibly alluding to the final or waning phase of the moon at the end of the Queen's reign, or perhaps the letter C for the moon goddess, Cynthia, or perhaps, even more audaciously, C for Cecil, the first Earl of Salisbury. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. That was a brilliant, brilliant overview of everything that's gone on. I know it was difficult to condense into 15 minutes, but really, really amazing work that you've done. So our next speaker this evening is going to be Karen Hearn, Honorary Professor at the University College London and formerly Curator of 16th and 17th century British art at Tate Britain. So Karen's specialism is British art from the Tudor and Stuart periods, and she's written extensively on representations of Elizabeth I. She has most recently co-authored a paper with Helen Hackett titled Elizabeth I at 60, which is due to be published next year. So over to you, Karen.
Thank you, Vanice, and thank you, Nicole, for that absolutely fabulous account of what you found. Queen Elizabeth I died on the 24th of March, 1603, at Richmond Palace. She was succeeded smoothly in the event by the son of Mary Queen of Scots, James VI of Scotland, who became James I of Great Britain. And that smoothness was largely the result of Robert Cecil's hard work in advance. James reached London in early May 1603. And actually, this is a great moment to mention that at the Portrait Gallery in Edinburgh next year, there's going to be an exhibition about James VI and I. Although many images of Elizabeth I have survived, it's clear that so many more must have been lost over the centuries. As well as the painted portraits, both large scale and in miniature, she was also, of course, represented in prints, on coins and medals, and in the opening capitals of official documents. In considering the surviving images of Elizabeth I, we always need to try to distinguish the small number for which she actually sat in person, and thus over which she might have had some form of agency. Because today, we think in terms of the process of photography, in which the person has to be physically present in front of the camera or mobile phone, we can forget how few first-hand sittings Elizabeth seems to have had with portrait painters. As Nicole indicated, most of the representations of her were either imagined or were copies after copies based on face patterns, drawn patterns. Some of the best-known paintings of Elizabeth were later given specific names, like the Ermine portrait of 1585 upstairs, and, of course, the Rainbow portrait. We know very little about the precise circumstances in which extant portraits of Elizabeth were made, including who commissioned them. Indeed, it's extremely rare to find a reference to a painting commission in any papers from this period. Artists who worked in England or after 1603 Britain at this time very rarely signed their works. So generally, we have to surmise who might have made a portrait by comparing its comparison, style, paint handling with those of other paintings from the period, particularly those very rare other paintings that do bear signatures, or ones that are in some way documented, and can thus be used as comparators. The word picture drawer was first used in the 1580s, and it would soon become an official term. So picture is the word that we're seeing in documents for portraits. We know the names of some people who carried out work for English courtiers during the 1590s and into the early years of the 17th century. As I indicated, we may occasionally find records of payments made to them, although we can seldom link surviving paintings with those references. The remarkable archives here at Hatfield are unusual in containing documents, as Nicole showed us, that do record payments to named artists, although those records are not always easy to interpret. So these painters generally headed studios, workshops, with various assistants, including apprentices. These assistants might paint particular elements of a portrait, or they might be the ones who made copies or variants or other versions of it, if those were required. On the continent, this was a well-established way of working. And, of course, many overseas-trained artisans, including painters, were active in Elizabethan London. Some had come initially as religious exiles from the southern Netherlands, which remained Catholic, and especially from the city of Antwerp. Limning, which is the term generally applied to painting in watercolour on vellum, especially miniature portraits, was particularly popular with the English elite. Nicholas Hilliard, born in about 1547 in Exeter and trained as a goldsmith, was primarily a limner. He seems first to have painted Elizabeth in 1571, and he later wrote about how she chose to sit for him out of doors in natural light. This example is dated 1572. Only very occasionally did Hilliard work on a large scale in oil paint on wooden panel, and surviving examples of that date from the 1570s. From around either side of 1590, there are a few images that show Elizabeth as a visibly older woman. And as you heard, my colleague Helen Hackett and I are addressing that in an essay which is being published next year, Elizabeth I at 60. So one of those images is this unfinished miniature by Hilliard's limner pupil, Isaac Oliver, born in France, and Nicole has mentioned Oliver already. It was probably made in around 1589. There then seems to have been a change of policy, which resulted in what Roy Strong has called the Mask of Youth template, as Nicole has indicated, which was apparently developed by Hilliard. It shows Elizabeth, then around the age of 60, as a young woman with smooth, rounded face and girlish curls. On screen, I'm showing just one of a number of examples, and the fashions that she wears in them tend to date them from late in her reign. Another English-born painter, Robert Peake, had also originally trained as a goldsmith. The earliest known references to him making portraits are in 1590. In 1603, at the start of James I's reign, Lord and Lady Harrington of Exton commissioned from Peake this pair of full-length portraits of James's heir, Henry, Prince of Wales, with their own son, Sir John Harrington, and a portrait of James's daughter, Princess Elizabeth, who was in their care, in distinctive outdoor country settings. So the Harringtons were very keen to promote and to record their own new closeness to the new royal family. In 1591, the London-based, splendidly named painter Roland Bucket travelled to Istanbul to deliver gifts from Elizabeth I to the Sultan, Mehmet III, a mechanical organ and a clock. And where we were having drinks, there is the organ at the end of the loggia, painted by Bucket, because Bucket's most significant client would be Robert Cecil, and various bills from him to Cecil survive in the archive here. The first of those is dated October 1606. Bucket carried out extensive decorative work for Cecil at Tybalt's Palace, the palace which he then exchanged with James I in 1607. He also worked extensively at Salisbury House, Cecil's home on the Strand in London, and after 1607, here at the new house that Cecil began to build at Hatfield. No portraits by Bucket are known to survive, although he apparently did produce some royal portraits for the East India Company in 1614. He also painted religious pictures on canvas for Cecil for the chapel here at Hatfield, and I think we saw some on our earlier tour. However, as you've heard from Nicole, the two leading London painters at this time were both second-generation migrants, Marcus Girards the Younger, or Marcus Girards II, and John de Critz, the overseas-born sons of Protestant parents who had escaped to London from the southern Netherlands. They were related by marriage, and in 1603, both were in their early 40s. De Critz had been born in about 1560, brought as a baby from Antwerp to London, where he trained with the Flemish-born exiled artist and poet Lucas de Heere. In the 1580s, de Critz had travelled on the continent on missions for Sir Francis Walsingham. In the early 1590s, he established a workshop in London. And by 1599, he had gained the powerful patronage of Robert Cecil. 1599 is the date on the earliest of the many surviving portraits of Cecil, all of which conform to the same basic pattern, with a few variations. So there's one over there, one over there. I think there are 8 at Hatfield in all. So this patronage by Cecil may have influenced King James's decision to grant de Critz the promise of the key office of Sergeant Painter in September 1603. In April 1604, de Critz, born abroad, as I said, applied for denization, that's a form of naturalisation, and after the death of the in-post Sergeant Painter, Leonard Fryer the Elder, in 1605, he took up that role formally. As early as 1603-4, the London Merchant Taylors Company paid de Critz for producing, quote, pictures of Elizabeth I, James I, and James's Queen Anne, or Anna, and their son Henry, suggesting that he hit the ground running in terms of access to the new royal family. De Critz must have painted the first portraits of James painted in England, of which the one on the screen is just one of many variants and copies. So, as you've seen, as Nicole showed us, that key bill of the 16th of October 1607 for work done for Cecil by de Critz itemises various portraits, including one of James I and a number of Cecil himself, probably produced by those studio helpers. Most of them, as Nicole indicated, were priced at £4 each. And then there is that intriguing payment of £1, quote, for altering a picture of Queen Elizabeth. In 1608, however, it was reported that de Critz had lost his eyesight, possibly rather suddenly, and was no longer able to paint. His studio carried on producing paintings, those helpers carrying them out. Marcus Gerrits the Younger's artist father had brought him from Bruges to London as a small child, while the father, Gerrits the Elder, the man who painted the 2 remarkable narrative scenes that flank the rainbow portrait here, so behind me on either side, Gerrits the Elder was back in the Netherlands by the late 1580s, but the younger Marcus seems to have made his entire career in London. His earliest portraits date from the start of the 1590s, and I should mention that he too was paid for decorative painting for Queen Elizabeth's household, particularly of coaches and carriages. So very common for portrait painters of the period to be painting decorative surfaces as well. Many, many years later, in 1644, the Latin caption on this posthumous print, which was made after Gerrits's now lost self-portrait, and I've blown it up at the bottom so you can hopefully read it, proclaimed him, in translation, to be Marcus Garrett the painter in the service of the most illustrious and serene princes, Elizabeth and Anne, so that will be James's Queen Anne, of blessed memory, queens of Great Britain, France, and Ireland. And indeed, as we've seen, in around 1592, Gerrits painted the mature Elizabeth I in the celebrated Ditchley portrait, one of those named images that I mentioned earlier. It's the largest surviving portrait of her at 95 by 60 inches, that's 241 by 152 centimetres, although it was once even larger before it was cut down at the sides, presumably in the 18th or 19th century. It came from the Lee family at Ditchley in Oxfordshire and is presumed to have been commissioned by Sir Henry Lee, Elizabeth I's retired champion, who had hosted the Queen and her entourage at his great house there in late September 1592, offering elaborate entertainments in which it is thought this portrait featured. Over the next decade, Lee commissioned a number of portraits, particularly of himself from Gerrits, and they present common elements of composition and paint handling. The Ditchley, of course, shows Elizabeth as a visibly older woman before the implementation of the Mask of Youth mode of presentation. It seems clear that after De Critz's loss of sight in around 1608, Gerrits became the chosen painter of royal portraits to be sent overseas. Portraits of Queen Anne by Gerrits survive from about 1610 onwards, and he was paid for various other pictures. £79, so we're getting into bigger sums now. £79 in 1611 for portraits of James and Anne and their daughter Princess Elizabeth, to be sent to the Margrave of Brandenburg, and in 1618, £85 for a set that comprised James, Anne, Elizabeth, and Prince Charles, later Charles I, for a Polish destination. So this was the artistic landscape, and these were the leading painters in London in the years during which the rainbow portrait is presumed to have been painted. I've always thought that the likeliest candidate was Marcus Gerrits II, and in recent years this attribution has become the most accepted one. But in spite of everything that has been written about it, there is still so much more to learn about this remarkable and extraordinarily confident image. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. I should have said also after Nicole's that we will have a Q&A at the end of all four speakers, so please do salt away any questions that you have for our speakers. You will have the opportunity to ask them. So our next speaker is going to be Susan North, who is Curator of Fashion before 1800 at the Victoria and Albert Museum. Susan has published extensively on historical dress and was awarded the Leo Gershoy Award in 2021 from the American History Association for her book, Sweet and Clean, Bodies and Clothes in Early Modern England. Susan will speak to us this evening about Elizabethan fashion and specifically mask costume and portraiture. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Venice, and thank you everyone for coming. It's a great honor to be invited to speak to you today and to be standing in front of this amazing portrait. I was very excited to see the work that Nicole was doing and follow the progress of the conservation. And to learn about the research that she had done. And it really made me question more closely the clothing that we see the Queen wearing in this portrait, the rainbow portrait, which has been identified many years ago as mask costume by renowned dress historians Jana Arnold, Aileen Ribeiro, Jane Ashelford. But nobody has really sort of asked why she's wearing it in this portrait and why it is so different from the dress we see the Queen wearing in all the other portraits that survive of her. Now, as mentioned, the art historian Roy Strong has suggested that the rainbow portrait was commissioned for an entertainment held by Robert Cecil in December 1602 at his new London residence, which we know the Queen attended, and the suggestion is that she would have seen this portrait, that it was indeed a centerpiece of that entertainment. So what are we talking about when we talk about mask costume? So certainly the court mask, which was a performance at court, has a very long tradition through Elizabeth's reign and before. It was performed by professional actors who were always men or teenage boys or older boys who represented female characters, just as on the public stage in Elizabethan England. The Office of the Revels have long lists of materials for these costumes, and the different characters that they were made for. But we don't have very many illustrations of what this professional court mask costume was like. And in fact, it's this portrait of Elizabeth with the three goddesses which gives us a best indication of what professional court mask costume would have looked like. And we've got Juno and Athena here, and it would have been obvious for the artist, how is he going to portray them? He's going to look to characters from Court Mask and reproduce the costume that they wear. And I should point out that the nudity, of course, is entirely pictorial. Nobody appeared at court naked. And if we look through the records of the Office of Revels for a costume for Venus, it would have been quite substantial. But what this portrait really illustrates is the contrast between the Queen, very regally and represented in a very dignified way in her court dress, which consists of a formal gown with a decorative forepart, and then she's got a loose gown with a long train behind. It's very, very different from what we see the goddesses wearing. So a reminder that the performers entertained for the Queen in her court, not the other way around. She never appeared in a mask. And indeed, that's why when Anne of Denmark appears in the Samuel Daniels vision of 12 goddesses in 1604, everybody was shocked and appalled. For the English court, this was an outrageous breach of royal decorum. Now, in the 1590s, we get the first evidence of amateur participation in masque by young aristocratic women in masks for more private occasions. Lady Elizabeth Russell stages a masque for the Queen at Bisham Abbey in 1592, in which her two daughters participate. However, there are no descriptions, let alone illustrations, of what they wore. But in 1600, Lady Elizabeth Russell again, her daughter Anne, who is one of the Queen's maids of honor, is getting married to Henry Somerset. Her mum organizes the wedding and the entertainment. And we have this letter that notes this amateur participation in the masque. There is to be a memorable masque of 8 ladies. Their attire is this: each hath a skirt of cloth of silver, a rich waistcoat wrought with silks and gold and silver, a mantle of carnation taffeta cast under the arm, and their hair loose about their shoulders. So this amateur costume is actually quite different from the professional version. And there's really only one other portrait from this period showing this style of mask costume that also corresponds to what we see in the rainbow portrait. And it's this rather mysterious image from the royal collection. So it's been attributed to Marcus Garretts the Younger, but we don't know the name of the young woman, and it hasn't been dated. But when we look at what she's wearing and match it up with this description from the wedding of Lady Anne Russell, we can see some similarities. So the rich waistcoat wrought with silks and gold and silver, you see the sleeve of her waistcoat there. She actually has the petticoat and mantle of the same material, unlike the wedding mask, which were cloth of silver and contrasting fabrics, but the same style of garments, which we also see in the rainbow portrait. So this waistcoat of white silk embroidered with colors, colored silks and gold and silver. We can't actually see the skirt or petticoat that the Queen is wearing. It's completely covered up by her mantle, but she would have had a petticoat underneath. Now, these garments, every woman in Elizabethan England had a waistcoat and a petticoat. And certainly so did aristocratic women, and so did the Queen. But the point is that these are actually very informal garments. They're not what aristocratic women and the Queen wore in public or to court, and they're not what they wear for a formal portrait. And just to illustrate, again, from the lists of the New Year's gifts given to the Queen, there are 2 waistcoats described there of white silk embroidered with flowers and with gold and silver that could correspond very well to what we see in the portrait. And as Nicole has already mentioned, the veil that we see and the silver wire supporting it, again, these show up in her wardrobe accounts. And just to illustrate that this color of orange was actually a very popular color at the time, and Elizabeth had a number of garments in this color. A cloak of orange-colored velvet. She also had gowns of orange satin and petticoats of orange taffeta, and so on. So what are the distinguishing features of this amateur version of mass costume? Well, the fanciful headdress, the fact that both the Queen and our unknown lady have their hair loose. They're not wearing a farthingale, which is all part of formal court dress at this time. And they're both wearing a mantle, which really isn't part of fashionable dress or court dress. And I imagine some of you are saying, so her hair is loose, big deal. Well, it would have been a big deal, and I could spend half an hour talking about 16th century hair. But I'm just going to use one portrait to illustrate how important for women having one's hair properly dressed was. So here's Barbara Sidney and her 6 children. We've got baby Robert, who's 1 year old, and he's wearing the standard clothes that babies wear, both boys and girls, for this time. His hair is short, cropped, and he's wearing a cap over top. His little sister, Philippa here, is 2 years old. She's wearing exactly the same clothing and her hair is styled the same way. Next to her is her sister, Elizabeth, who's 4 years old. So that's the little girl right on the far left. And her hair, she's 4 years old, her hair is dressed exactly like her mother's. So William in the center, the oldest boy, the heir, he's still in his petticoats, but we know he's identified as the male heir. He's wearing a doublet, he's got a sword, and his hair is cut short and combed, as was traditional for young boys. And then his sisters, Catherine and Mary, Catherine who's 7, Mary 9, again, their hair is dressed just like their mother's. So for Elizabethan women, you start at the age of 4 to dress your hair appropriately. And if we look closer at these portraits, particularly that of the Queen, the hair around the face is in fact actually dressed. We've just got a few strands of hair loose at the back. So controlled looseness, loose but not disheveled in any way. And Nicole has already mentioned the sources from costume books for the headdresses here. This is a very popular genre of book in the 16th century purporting to illustrate the clothing worn by all people around the world with sort of various degrees of accuracy. And we do know that those designing mask costume for the court and for this amateur version were regularly sort of rifling through these books looking for inspiration. But what's interesting, I think, is the fact that no other portraits of Queen Elizabeth I show her in mask costume. And as I say, there would be no occasion in her life for which she would have worn it. These are more typical representations that we see in the surviving portraits. On your right, we have the Darnley portrait from the 1570s, which is actually a rare portrayal of her in informal dress. So this is as informal as it gets for Queen Elizabeth I. In this robe of brocaded silk, which has a bodice that is styled like a man's doublet, buttons all the way up the front, a modest ruff. Again, her hair is dressed, and she has a smaller veil. Certainly it's more subdued than what we see on the left there, which is very formal court dress for the 1590s, signified by the low bodice, the low-cut bodice, and the wheel farthingale, which was de rigueur for court dress and for fashionable dress in England in the 1590s. Now, I should point out that you don't have to be wearing mask costume in order to have to imbue your portrait with symbolism, which has already been pointed out by Karen and Nicole. And just to give you two examples here, the Pelican portrait on the left, the Sieve portrait on the right. So called because the pelican, she's got a pendant of a pelican around her neck, and she's holding a sieve. Well, what does this all mean? And many of you will be very familiar with this rich visual and literary tradition of symbolism in the 16th century in the genre of the emblem book, which had a very typical format, which was a visual image, a motto in Latin, and then a moral poem accompanying it. The first emblem books were published in Italy in the 1530s. They were hugely popular and circulated throughout Europe, and everybody else, the French and the English, think, well, right, we can do our versions too. And I'm showing you the version, A Choice of Emblems from Geoffrey Whitney, which was the first emblem book published in the English language. And so the symbolism of the pelican, when she can find no food for her chicks, she pierces her breast and feeds them with her own blood. So symbolizing maternal sacrifice. The sieve emblem is reminding monarchs of the importance of weighing up the value of your courtiers, separating the wise from the deceitful. And so for anyone educated or elite in England, at this time, the minute you saw the symbol of the pelican, you knew exactly what the message was, the relationship with the emblem book, and similarly the sieve. And as Nicole and Karen have already explained, Elizabeth did not sit for these portraits. She had Nicholas Hilliard take the face patterns. And so anyone commissioned to do a portrait of her would secure or copy one of these patterns, We do know that the clothing depicted is very accurate. There's documentation noting that artists would borrow her clothing from the royal wardrobe, and very often one of her ladies in waiting would wear it and pose for the portrait, so the artist could capture the very specific details of embroidery and lace that we see. And also, as we've heard already, again, these were not portraits that were commissioned by the Queen. Although there's not a lot of documentation around them, the assumption is that they were commissioned by her courtiers, and very often in relation to her summer progresses, where she would travel through Britain during the summer, visiting her courtiers at their country seat. And so these would be commissioned either in advance of her arrival, sort of, ta-da, Your Majesty, or in commemoration of her visit. The Queen was here. But I think what's really important is these were all created with a view that she would see them and with the desire that she would approve of them. And certainly by the 1590s, what we see are these very regal, very dignified representations of her in court dress, the formal gown, and the farthingale. So I was very intrigued to discover that Nicole's investigations showed that the portrait was repainted a few years after it was finished. And obviously, we believe that it was done in 1607, according to the bills. So this would have been done, repainted after her death. And I was intrigued to see that it's basically the same costume underneath. And I feel that had it been painted for her visit to Robert Cecil's new home in London in 1602, I would expect to see some version of 1590s court dress underneath, and then perhaps repainted in 1607 to make it more allegorical. And certainly she could be wearing this ensemble, she could still have the snake embroidered on her sleeve, she could still have all her emblematic jewelry. Her petticoat could have been painted, the eyes and ears could have been painted on her petticoat. In her hand, instead of a fan or gloves, she could have the rainbow. That would be perfectly plausible. So, but that's not what we see. So I think that I agree with Nicole that this was painted after her death. There was no expectation that she would ever see it. And I'm just about to sum up here, and here's where I start to speculate very wildly. So Robert Cecil has just overseen this successful transition from Elizabeth I to James I. Very peacefully, there was no violence, there were no rebellions, no uprisings, no pretenders. All went extremely well. But the Stuarts were a very different sort of royalty, and the court that they created was very different from Elizabeth's. So is this Cecil's nostalgic homage to his late queen, using the conventions of mass costume to represent her allegorically, with all the emblems that commemorate the best of her reign and Cecil's service to her as her closest and most trusted advisor. So I'll end there, and I'm going to hand over to Stephen, who's probably going to tell me this last bit was all rubbish. Thank you.
Stephen's busily rewriting his intro now, I'm sure. Thank you so much, Susan. So last but not least, we do have Stephen Alford speaking to us. So Stephen is Professor of Early Modern British History at the University of Leeds and taught previously at Cambridge for 15 years. Stephen has published 7 books on Tudor history, 2 of which relate specifically to the early Cecils, with his most recent book, All His Spies, concentrating on the life of Robert Cecil. So Stephen's going to provide us with some further historical context for the Rainbow Portrait by speaking about Robert Cecil's relationship with Elizabeth I as her minister in the final years of her reign. All right, Stephen, take it away.
This is going to be a rare moment of complete scholarly agreement. So no acrimony at all. I think that's dead right. So I'm going to sort of try and build a bit of a picture over the next few minutes of Robert Cecil's relationship with Elizabeth and his potential readings of the Queen at the point of change and transition and a new reign. Now, rarely in history can anyone have watched a monarch as closely as Robert Cecil did Elizabeth I. He went to court as a young man in 1584, and 4 years later, at the very least, or the very latest, the Queen had given him what he called a sporting name, though he didn't like it very much. It was Pygmy, a poke at Robert's size and physique, and a great favour from a monarch with a chip of ice in the heart. In 1591, Elizabeth appointed him Privy Councillor. Just over 5 years later, in 1596, she made him her principal secretary, her eyes and ears. But these really are punctuation points in a bigger story for Robert Cecil. A longer story which we began for him in childhood, because he was really the legacy project, in a sense, of his father, the great Baron of Burghley. He was born in Westminster, for the corridors of power. He was always going to serve the Queen. And who was that Queen? As we've seen, I think so wonderfully from the presentation so far and the images, she was in many ways an ideal. She was a fantasy. She was praised and flattered and stylized. But of course, there was a human reality as well, especially in those later years, because there's a sense of decline, and a decline, I think, in Elizabeth's health, perhaps her mental health, more than her physical health, from 1601, especially 1602. These kind of critical moments before the end of the reign, and critical moments, as I'll explain in a minute or two, in this sort of transition, which Robert Cecil is very much part of. And Robert saw the human reality. He saw the office, he served the office of the Queen, and he saw in day-to-day audience the woman herself. And he described this so beautifully, I think, to Sir Christopher Hatton in 1591. He distinguished between Elizabeth Regina, the office, and the Queen's Majesty, the woman. And he saw the tensions of having an office that was a sort of divinity contained within the physical vessel, the human mortal body of the woman. The Queen's two bodies, as Elizabethans phrased it. And so here was a queen, I think he saw day to day, who was full of ambiguities, inconsistencies, and tensions. She was brilliant, she was precocious, she was difficult, she was querulous, she was perceptive, she was obtuse, She was vain, penetrating, infuriating. Her courtiers often compared her to the weather, and often stormy weather. And the weather changes, and it could change very rapidly with Elizabeth. And there was a sense, I think, for this queen that she both needed to be at the center of attention, yet also guarded her privacy, and certainly her own prerogative and her powers as a ruler very carefully indeed. She knew that she was always under observation, that she was always, to a certain extent, public property. Famous words from 1586. "We princes, I tell you, are set on stages, in the sight and view of all the world duly observed. The eyes of many behold our actions. A spot is soon spied in our garments, a blemish quickly noted in our doings." Note the reference to garments. They're important. They're an aspect, a presentational aspect of the queen and everything she was and represented. Now, all of that sounds very high-minded, and I think it's important to recognize with Elizabeth that in politics and diplomacy, she invariably had the skill to look the other way and a deep instinct to dodge the consequences of her own decisions. The queen would have her ministers do that she will not avow, as Robert Cecil put it in 1594. And when something particularly tricky had to be done, she had a fantastic talent for simply looking the other way. But woe betide the minister who mistakenly exposed what was really going on. All this Robert Cecil saw, and his wife, Lady Elizabeth, always known to Robert and to the family generally as Bess, who was one of the Queen's ladies. And they and all their courtiers played a game. And I think we've had a really good sense of that so far this evening, sort of visually. But they do it linguistically too. They try to outdo each other in effusive praise of Elizabeth, to treat her lavishly, especially when they invited her and her court to their estates. Hosts on royal progresses fell over themselves, indeed sometimes ruined themselves, to put on fantastically elaborate and expensive entertainments. The language they used was ornate, for us, saccharine. But Elizabeth seemed, in poetry, in masque, in art, almost superhuman, ethereal, and, again, as we've heard so wonderfully, ageless as well. That agelessness was so important. And even Robert Cecil could turn on this kind of flattery when he needed to. Especially in moments of absence, Elizabethan courtiers had kittens when they were away from the Queen. They hated absence. They needed to be there. They needed to be present and to have a relationship with her. To be apart from her was almost a physical pain. And frankly, you don't know what your rivals are up to as well. So that distance, that absence, is really important. And he wrote, at a time of absence in 1592, he wrote as the servile minister of a monarch whose almost supernatural qualities dazzled him. And he doubted, as all courtiers and ministers did, his own worthiness to serve her. And you get a sense, I think, in this quotation of the language. You have to kind of just go with it, really, and sort of absorb yourself in it. "I hope the end of this my travail," he wrote to her, "shall be accepted with no less grace than the beginning is vouchsafed. For I have no other purpose of living but to witness what I would perform if I had the power. If I could do more than any man, it were less than nothing, balanced with my desires. If I could do as much as all the world, it were neither praise nor thanks worthy in respect of the duty I owe and the princess whom I serve. That's the language and that's the connection that Robert needed with her queen, his queen. We've heard a little bit so far in the evening about the invitation to Robert's new house on the Strand, Cecil House, later Salisbury House, in 1602. And it plays an important part in the scholarship, in the making sense over the decades of the Rainbow portrait. And it was between the Thames and the Strand. It was a stone's throw from the house in which he'd really grown up, one of the houses in which he'd grown up, in which he was born, but which now belonged to his brother Thomas, his father's heir. And it's a really interesting moment. It's December 1602, Elizabeth turns up, she seems to have a perfectly good time, there are entertainments, there's no mention of a portrait, there's no mention of any kind of presentation other than really the presentation of entertainment to the Queen. And there's a rather wonderful entertainment put on, or written by a poet called Sir John Davies. And it's a wonderful dialogue between a post, a courier, and a gentleman usher posted outside the Queen's rooms. And of course, Elizabeth is sitting there, Cecil's sitting there, and her courtiers are sitting there. And the post dashes up with a letter from the Emperor of China, and he wants to know where the Queen's secretary is. And the gentleman usher says, well, you know, he's not here, but the Queen is. Hand it to the Queen. No. I need to hand this to the secretary. Well, of course, you know, hand it to the Queen. She has learning, you know, she is superlative in her learning and understanding and experience. She'll be able to translate it and understand. No, I need to hand it to the secretary. It's a wonderful moment because at that point, by that point, for a number of months, Robert Cecil had been engaged in a secret correspondence with the king, who turns out, not accidentally, to be Elizabeth's successor, James VI and First. Now, John Davies would have known nothing about this, but I almost can see in my mind Robert Cecil sort of slipping down, you know, as the performance goes on. He knew that his job was to settle the succession because Elizabeth refused to do anything about it. You know, it's fingers and ears, it's closing eyes, it's pretending it's not happening. So she does nothing at all. And it's another lecture and I don't have time. But there's an extraordinary sort of secret correspondence, a sort of almost pen to pen negotiation between Robert Cecil and James and a few very, very close ministers, simply because Elizabeth refuses to do anything about it. And Robert Cecil later explained to a friend and correspondent why it was that he had made that decision. It was to keep Elizabeth safe, it was to secure James's succession, and the two for him were connected. If you secure the succession, you secure Elizabeth's security in those final years. But this is an interesting word, I think, in the context of this picture, with a question mark dating, perhaps, of 1607 in its final form. It's a word he uses in 1608. He wrote to his friend about the Queen's orbity in those final days. And orbit is a really interesting word from its Latin root. It's a rather complicated word that somehow brings together childlessness. Of course, Elizabeth famously doesn't marry and doesn't produce an heir, and that's precisely the problem, and also bereavement. There's a sense of a queen in her declining years. And Robert Cecil is the man who has to do something about it. And he wrote in his first secret letter to James, "Sir, I know it holdeth so just proportion, even with strictest loyalty and sound reason, for faithful ministers to conceal sometime both thoughts and actions from princes when they are persuaded it is for their own greater good." So Elizabeth knows nothing about this, but Robert Cecil knows this has to be done. And interesting, that he wrote those words about ministerial concealment to his next boss. So interesting on many, many, many levels. The process, I think, of adaptation from Elizabethan to Jacobean is complex. The world changed completely, I think. You go from this small, intense, gloomy court in the late Elizabethan years to a sudden kind of opening up of a new court with so many courtiers and a completely different style of kingship. And it's really interesting, if we think about this portrait as an early Jacobean portrait, I wonder whether, in a sense, it is, for Robert Cecil, a picture on which to meditate, a way to recover the Elizabeth of their relationship with Queen and minister. He wrote in 1592 to her about his admiring thoughts, which always, travelling from wonder to wonder, spend themselves in contemplation, being absent. And of course, she is definitively absent by this point, but being absent and present in reading secretly the story of marvels in that more than human perfection. So perhaps this is a picture on which to meditate, and a commemoration of a reign and an age gone and past definitively. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Stephen. So it's now time to hand the floor over to you. If any of you have any questions, I've got a roving microphone, so I will come to you with the microphone. If you could just raise your hand, if you've got anything to ask. Yes. Testing the microphone. Is it working? Can you hear from it? No? Sound, people, please.
If you speak up, you could probably hear.
Can you hear? Yeah? Okay. Oh, I can start.
Hi. I think I've read it before, but I just wanted to be reminded what the inscription is over the rainbow there. What that means.
No rainbow without the sun.
That's it. Thank you. That's what I'm...
All right. Any other hands? Yes.
Hi. You discussed earlier about how when X-raying the portrait, they found the sketches that there'd been an armillary sphere for the earring, and also on the head of the snake. There's debate about this connection with Anne Boleyn with the armillary sphere, but what does it particularly represent in this portrait, and what's it trying to say about Elizabeth?
Sorry, what's the armillary sphere?
Yeah.
Well, there are lots of different theories about this, aren't there? But do you want to answer this one?
Not really, but armillary spheres do appear in a number of guises in portraiture of this period. And Sir Henry Lee, who had commissioned the Ditchley portrait, had himself portrayed earlier while he was in the Netherlands, and he had embroidered armillary spheres on his sleeve. So when we see it in the Ditchley portrait, we know that's a link with Henry Lee. And I guess the fact that it's raised here, what do you think? What do you think's going on there?
I really don't know. It's not exactly the same as the earring in the Ditchley portrait. The central band goes the opposite way. There are different gems. There is actually a ribbon at the top as well, probably. I have absolutely no idea why it was changed. Maybe the earring that it was changed to was more fashionable in the Jacobean period, and I think a jewellery historian might have some view on that. But I think those larger chandelier earrings are probably more Jacobean in style.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions? Yes?
I noticed in one of the other portraits that she had a ring on one of her right hand fingers, but most of the time she doesn't wear rings. Was there a particular reason for this? Did they indicate anything of society wearing rings in those times?
You were asking about, you were saying that in one of the portraits shown, Elizabeth was wearing a ring, but otherwise she's not shown as wearing rings. That's a very interesting question. Jewellery is incredibly important in portraits of this period. Something I've looked into in the past is not so much looking at Elizabeth herself, but the question of married women being depicted wearing rings on any finger, or very often the thumb. The kind of symbolism, significance to do with rings at this period was obviously different from perhaps what we have now. Keep going back to this point that these portraits are total constructions. They are, every sort of decision has been made by the person who's commissioned the picture in collaboration with whoever has painted it. Very seldom, very, very seldom, Elizabeth has anything to do with it. So obviously a choice is being made that Elizabeth has, she is not a married woman, she is unmarried, and that perhaps we do see her without wearing rings.
And we do know that, of course, she had lots of jewellery in her wardrobe, in the jewel house, and her inventories include long lists of jewels, which also include rings. And again, as I was saying, the clothes would have been borrowed from the royal wardrobe, and the jewellery from the jewel house as well. So again, we don't quite know what decisions, who made the decision about what clothing was going to be worn, or perhaps it might have even been that one of the ladies in waiting who posed happened to have a ring on her finger and the artist captured it. Possibly whoever commissioned it had given the Queen a gift of a ring and wanted this representation to show that she was wearing that ring. It's very, very hard to be exactly precise, to try and read these portraits that literally.
Okay, one more question, I think. This was the first hand up here.
Thank you very much for four absolutely fantastic presentations. Could you tell us a little more about the display of the portrait over time, or what we know about the display? For example, perhaps from inventories of rooms and so on, and also about the choice of frame. I first saw this portrait as an A-level student 40 years ago in preparation for writing about it in A-level history. So it's a joy to see it today and what's been done, but I don't remember this frame, but I might be wrong. Perhaps you can tell us.
I can say something about the frame. So the frame is a reproduction frame made by a firm called John Davies. They're based in Norwich. I don't know what the whole background to the design for it is, but I don't think we know what the original frame would have looked like. But this is a reproduction frame. And with regard to where the painting was, there's a very good catalogue, Hatfield catalogue of paintings and sculpture, written, well, the period that we're interested in here is written by Erna Auerbach. And if you get hold of this catalogue, it gives a lot of information about those inventories and a lot of speculation as to which painting is being referred to, you know, which is the rainbow, which is the ermine, and where they were at various times. I would suggest that's the book to look at if you want to, you know, look at Erna Auerbach's writings about the early inventories and where the painting was. But it's very unclear, and we don't really know where this painting was in the first couple of decades of the 17th century, because we can't tell which painting of Elizabeth they're talking about, and they don't describe paintings very exactly.
Absolutely. And I would just kind of add to that after, it's 1971, isn't it, Auerbach and Adams, the catalogue, in about 2000, there was a very interesting collection of essays published about the early Cecils. And there's an essay in there by Susan Bracken, which talks about Cecil as a collector, publishes an additional inventory that Auerbach and Adams didn't know about. But, I mean, the key thing is that there are portraits of Elizabeth here, there are portraits at the London House, but it's impossible to identify which they were with present-day ones.
Okay. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for this evening, but I wanted to thank you once again for coming out to join us and our wonderful panel of experts. Would you please give them another round of applause? It's been really wonderful. It's been really wonderful celebrating the return of the portrait to Hatfield House. We definitely did feel its absence, I suppose, while it was away, so it's fantastic to have it back here in the Marble Hall. And we're truly delighted to have had you all here with us tonight. And just before we go, we also wanted to extend an extra special thank you to Nicole, who we are so grateful to work with here at Hatfield and who has gone above and beyond to help us make this event a huge success and to preserve our collections for generations to come. So if we could give her one more round of applause. Again, thank you so much, and I hope you all really enjoyed this evening and will join us in the future for other events. Thank you very much. Bye.